Canadian traveler, novice journalist Amanda Lindhout spent 460 days in Somalia in hellish captivity. She talked with me about the unbelievable and absurd events she endured at the hands of teenage captors. Her best-selling memoir of her early troubled life and 15 months of harrowing captivity is called A House in the Sky. Here is our conversation. How nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too, Fanny.
So take me back to Sylvan Lake, to Red Deer, Alberta, a young woman. How did you discover, or when did you discover you needed to escape Alberta and experience the world?
I grew up in a pretty poor household. My mom was a cashier at a grocery store at Food City for most of my childhood, so traveling wasn't something that my family did, but I always dreamed of the world outside of Sylvan Lake and Red Deer, and if you're not familiar with it, it's a small agricultural community. I grew up, like a lot of people, in a dysfunctional home, a home where there was often a lot of violence. And so my escape back then was in the pages of National Geographic magazine, which I kept in a big stack beside my bed and which I reached for when things got tough in my house. And I dreamed of one day finding a way to get myself out into the world to these beautiful, colorful, exotic places that I saw in the pages.
Did you ever think about going to war zones?
When I was a young girl, no, it wasn't those places that attracted me at all. It was the colorful and exotic and beautiful places like India, places like Thailand. And then when I was 19 years old and I was finally able to take myself out into the world, it wasn't to a war zone, it was to Venezuela, to go and enjoy the tropical paradise that is that country.
Take me back to the violence in the basement suite. Your mother's boyfriend beat her up. You witnessed that, your brothers witnessed that. Mm-hmm. Where did you go in your head when that was happening?
That was when I reached for my magazines. That was when I would imagine myself being in a place that was much more beautiful than this dark environment that was my home. So it was for many years growing up that my mom was an abused woman, and home was not a happy place to be.
Home with mom. What about home with dad?
Home with dad was a happier place to be, but also maybe a little bit outside the box. My dad came out as a gay man in central Alberta when I was 8 or 9 years old. And he's been with his partner Perry now for, I believe they've been together for 24 years, so a real long time now. But that was also not entirely easy. So,
dad, the talk of the town, obviously. You in a dysfunctional relationship, although loving your mother, but worried about her. Mm-hmm. It sounds like Jerry Springer Show stuff.
Yep, and I'll be the first one to say that. There's a line in my book where I compare my childhood to not just a Jerry Springer show, but a whole season of Jerry Springer shows. And I myself, as a young woman, too, contributed to that. I had my own issues. I dealt with a lot of what was happening in my household. I developed an eating disorder as a teenager. It was a tough place to be.
You call this book A House in the Sky. What does that mean?
My house in the sky was a place that I needed to go to in my own mind to escape later in life after I had been abducted and during the very worst things that happened to me. When I needed a refuge, when I needed comfort, I could close my eyes and imagine the beauty of the world that I had experienced and think about the life that I had lived and think about the life that I wanted to go on and have if I made it out of there.
Your early travels, Sudan, Syria, Pakistan, Afghanistan, mm-hmm. outside the wire, embedded.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was a journey to get to those places. So the very first countries I went to were much more conventional. I traveled a lot around Southeast Asia and South and Central America, long before I ever started crossing borders into conflict zones or troubled places like Pakistan. What I was discovering about the world, though, is that the world isn't usually the really scary place we see on TV, that even countries like Pakistan, I was discovering I had far more in common with the people that I was meeting there than I did differences. They're people really just like you and I, trying to get by, trying to make a life for themselves, to be safe, to be educated.
And yet you were a woman alone, mm-hmm. traveling in dangerous countries at times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, people are surprised by that, and I get that question a lot. People wonder why I had that kind of confidence as a young woman. But I think you believe about the world what the world is showing you to be true. And because nothing bad, nothing really bad anyways, had happened to me, I think it's easy to believe that it never will.
And when did something really bad happen to you? First time?
In 2008, when I went to Somalia. So at that point in my life, I had crossed the line from being a backpacker to being an aspiring freelance journalist. I had met an Australian photographer in Ethiopia, a man named Nigel Brennan, who will come back into the story again later, who had inspired me a little bit to make more meaning out of my travels. Up until that point, I'd been having lots of fun and adventures, but there wasn't really a deeper purpose. And I thought maybe by sharing people's stories that I was hearing and these amazing cultures that I was learning about with others could maybe be the answer to a question I had asked myself as a young woman about what kind of difference I could make in the world. And it was with these journalistic ambitions that led me in 2008, August of 2008, to Somalia for what I thought was going to be a one-week work trip into the country.
Back to Nigel Brennan for a moment. You meet him in Ethiopia. He's a photographer, Australian. You fall in love.
Yeah, a handsome Australian photographer I saw sitting on the porch of a one-star hotel in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And we did have a brief romance together, and then a friendship that followed that. And it was kind of the last minute when Nigel decided he was going to join me for this one-week work trip into Somalia, and it's a decision that he may well spend the rest of his life regretting.
Well, I'm sure, or maybe not. We'd have to ask him. Do you ever see him?
Since our release, Nigel and I have really drifted apart, and it surprises people to hear that, but it's not so unusual between two people that have experienced that kind of trauma together. Perhaps we remind each other of that trauma now, so we're not really part of each other's lives anymore.
Well, and he was untruthful to you in the very beginning. He was married and forgot to tell you that.
I was not going to bring that up, but yes, it's true.
But it's in the book.
Yes, when we had our romance together, I did not know that he was married, and when he came clean and told me, we severed our romantic relationship. Yeah.
And I know you'd been slinging drinks in Calgary to make money so you could travel to all of these places. You needed perhaps some help. So you call Nigel and say, what about Somalia? What were you planning to do in Somalia?
Well, at that point, I had been living in Baghdad for about 7 or 8 months. So I had left my waitressing job in Calgary, which was what I would do. I would go off on these wonderful adventures around the world, go back home to Calgary, work for 5 or 6 months, bank a bunch of money, tips, and then take myself back out into the world. And in my mid-20s, I was taking myself back out into the world with a camera and with these ambitions to tell these stories. And so that's when I contacted Nigel and said, look, I'm making this trip. There were enormous costs involved. I had organized security. I've been, critics have been hard on me for the decision to go, and a lot of that criticism is legitimate, but I did take some measures for my safety, what I had been advised to do with Nigel. We had organized security for this trip, and we were going to go in and get a story from an internally displaced people's camp, and that was the plan.
And the best laid plans. When you were captured, do you remember what went through your head, what you thought was happening?
I was pulled out of a vehicle on a dusty road and found myself lying face down in the dirt with a gun held to the back of my head. And in that moment, I went into shock. It was a sense of disbelief. I thought maybe I was being robbed, and when I realized that wasn't happening, I thought maybe if I humanized myself to these young men, most of whom were teenagers, these masked men, that they might let me go if they realized that both Nigel and I were in the country because we genuinely cared about the humanitarian crisis that has been unfolding in Somalia for over 2 decades. But that was not the case.
And how did Nigel react?
We reacted very differently in those first days, weeks, and months. Nigel almost immediately fell into depression, and it probably helped me in some way that one of us needed to be strong, and that was upon me to be that person and to keep both of our spirits up in those first days.
And both of you needed to be clever, obviously.
Yeah, there was a lot of survival strategies that we used from the very first day, from trying to humanize ourselves to the captors to later converting to Islam as a survival strategy. Yeah, a lot of things along the way.
And that was down the road.
We converted to Islam on the 11th day of our captivity. And that was another one of my ideas. Because I had spent those months living in the Middle East, I knew that if I made that request to convert to Islam, they would be very likely to honor that. And in fact, they did.
And they gave you a Quran, a Holy Quran in English.
Which I also knew that they would be likely to do. So that was a really useful tool. On one side of the page was the English Quran, and on the other side was Arabic. So it became a way for me to communicate with these uneducated young men, most of whom hadn't been to school, who didn't have a great grasp of the English language. I could point to words on the page. So the conversation I was having with them became much bigger than just religion. It became about what my daily needs were as well. I was able to use this as a tool to convey that to them.
And they kept you where initially?
I was moved between a series of houses, abandoned houses. Somalia is a country that's been ravaged by so many years of war. So many people have fled the country that there are these abandoned houses all over the country, and they would lock us up inside.
And no comforts of home, obviously.
No comforts at home whatsoever. The rooms were usually filthy, with a thin foam mat on the floor with no electricity. There was electricity in 1 or 2 of the 13 houses that we were held in, but
some linoleum. You said in one chapter in the book, I lived a life of a piece of brown linoleum, a mosquito net, and a mattress.
Yeah, especially later when my freedom of movement became very restricted following a failed escape attempt. My prison was not even the size of the house I was held in or the room that I was held in. It was the size of the mat on the floor that I was forbidden to get up off of.
And asking permission to do anything, I'm assuming, to go to the bathroom.
Oh, there were rules about that. I was allowed to use the washroom 5 times a day for 3 minutes each time. They would time it with a stopwatch. And at the time that they implemented that rule, I was also in leg shackles. There were chains around my legs, so you can imagine how difficult it was to even get myself into that bathroom and out again with the 3 minutes hanging over my head.
And no privacy, obviously.
No, constant humiliation, having to use the toilet with no door closed. I mean, little things like that. That was my reality every single day.
And Nigel's too.
And Nigel's too. Nigel and I were separated after 2 months in captivity together. We were always kept in the same house, but we were put into 2 separate rooms. Though at different periods we found ways that we could secretly communicate with each other. But yes, absolutely, Nigel's conditions were also terrifying.
Being male, however, was he treated better?
He was.
At some level.
He was treated better, yeah. In Somali culture, there is an inherent respect for the older male. And Nigel was in his early 40s at the time we were abducted. And these teenage boys always had a harder time taking out their frustration and anger on him. And women, unfortunately, in parts of the country aren't valued much at all. And so that certainly worked against me.
And there is a rule, a law in the Quran that if a man has you, explain this to me, in his right hand,
right, so
it's okay to torture you and abuse you.
Well, I don't want to say that this was their interpretation of these particular verses of their religious text, that because I was abducted in a way that they perceived to be justified in Islamic law, I was a possession. I was held by their right hand in a godly way, and they owned me, and that meant all the things you can imagine it to mean. I was their property.
They could hurt you, assault you.
Yeah.
And it was okay.
And it was okay in their minds, based on their limited interpretation of their.
And limited it
yeah,
was.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
Let's take a break, and we'll talk more with Amanda Lindhout.